How's it going, y'all? And welcome back to this advanced series for climbers. Today I'm going to be going over more tools, tips, tactics, strategies, mental mindsets, all those things to help you become a better climber. Without delaying this intro, I'll go ahead and get started. Number 44, checkpoint climbing. As you get more advanced in climbing, the climbs become more advanced too. Sequences become more complex, which makes them harder to remember, and often this can make a climb feel much more overwhelming. If you're thinking about a sport climb and it is 80 moves, all very intense, there's a lot of foot beta that you need to think about, body positions. As we become more advanced, it's no longer just left, right. It is also, how hard am I trying for this move? When do I get to relax? Where exactly do I need to be in space to be able to do this? Which limb am I putting effort into? And pretty quickly, those 80 moves might feel like a mental mountain to climb. So what can we do about it? One method that you can use to make this more digestible is called checkpoint climbing. You take those 80 moves and you break them up. Break them up as many times as you need to. Typically, early on in a sport climbing project, you're going to have more checkpoints. Day one, it might be just every single bolt. You're kind of thinking about it as its own separate section or its own separate climb. The reason why this is so important is that as you get to bolt one, you can say, okay, cool. I've got first bolt out of the way. Now, all I have to think about is the next 7 moves. And it can kind of dampen down that feeling of overwhelm that, wow, I have so much ahead of me. As you get better at piecing together these checkpoints, kind of in your mind to where you can hold larger and larger sections without feeling overwhelmed, you'll find that you start to break them up maybe by rests. It might turn into, okay, from the ground to the knee bar at the 4th bolt, that's checkpoint 1. That's this first chunk. From there, bolt 4 to 6, that's a hard little cruxy section, but there's a good shake after that. So, okay, there's only 2 bolts since it's that hard. From bolt 6 to the anchors, it's kind of easy climbing, so it's okay that that's a 6 bolt length. So now you've got it down to 3 sections. As you continue to progress, it might even turn into just 2 segments, and then very often, right before you pull on for a red point, it's totally normal to look up at a climb and be like, oh, yeah, it just looks like one piece now. You can really accept this whole climb, this entire route, as just one big piece, and it no longer feels overwhelming or daunting. Ideally, that's what we want to kind of get to. We want to take all this complexity that we have in rock climbing and distill it down into as small of sections as we need to, that we can digest it and work on it and understand it in a way that will apply to better performance. Number 45, learn how to practice moves in ways that actually matter. What I mean by this, and hopefully you're working moves individually now. If you're not, get on that. That's a good start. If you fall on a move, work that move by itself. You're an advanced climber, so I assume you're already doing that. What we need to do now is make sure when we are practicing a singular move or a small section, it has to replicate the way we're going to encounter that move in sequence. So, a couple of things that are worth keeping in mind here. One common mistake, and I see this on sport climbs a lot, is people will pull on and they'll lock off a move as they're practicing it, even though it might be 80 feet up a sport climb and they're going to be way too pumped to be able to do it statically like that. So when you're rehearsing a move, you need to practice it in the way you're going to be able to physically do it at that time. If that's using momentum, if that is having to use intermediate holds rather than just doing a giant dead point past all of the small intermediates, whatever it is, you need to figure out, how am I going to feel doing this move from the ground? What position am I going to be in? Because you might just pull off the ground to rehearse a move on a boulder, but if your body isn't in the exact same position with the same level of tension as you would be from climbing into it, it might not do you any good to actually rehearse it that way. There are a lot of times, especially with very body position intensive climbs, as well as very body tension intensive climbs, you're better off doing the move from 1 or 2 moves lower and then climbing through it, because you're going to come into that sequence with the right position, with the correct amount of tension, and hopefully with the right amount of physical exertion to be able to rehearse the move the same way that you would if you were going to do it from the ground. This also applies for how things are going to feel mentally. If you're going to have to do a move or a whole sequence with a bolt skipped, let's say it's a working bolt on a hard route. So For anyone not familiar, on harder sport climbs, often bolts will go into hard sections like crux sections where they're never intended to really be clipped on point because that sequence is too hard to actually stop and clip, but it's really nice to be able to stop and work it. So the developer put a bolt there so that they could work the crux sequence without having to take these massive falls. And then on point, you just expect yourself to skip the bolt. If you're climbing on a route like this, then absolutely use the bolt to learn the crux. However, if you never rehearse it without that bolt unclipped, it's very common that you will get there and you will suddenly have this new mental battle that you're fighting. You thought you were just worried about the moves being hard. Suddenly, you're like, ooh, I've never taken this fall. This run out's a little bit bigger than I wanted it to be. All of these things will be going on. So in your practice period, at some point, you need to rehearse that sequence without that bolt clipped. Otherwise, there's no guaranteeing how you are going to mentally respond to being there more fatigued and with the pressure of trying to send. And if you're finding this helpful and want to support this channel, I would really appreciate it if you hit that subscribe button down below. Number 46, the front flag dilemma. Skills won't feel useful unless we get good at them. There is a common phrase in sports: we don't rise to the occasion, we fall to the level of our preparation. And this is so true with climbing technique. If you have never practiced a skill or really developed it, you're not going to suddenly be good at using it or even really recognize that it exists out in the wild. And there are a lot of skills and even ways of applying strength that a lot of climbers miss out on because they just never use them. The front flag is a great example of this. Most climbers never use a front flag where they're flagging in between their body and the wall. And so they never know when to use it. They never see them on a route or a boulder. And so they never get good at them. And a lot of times this also means they just write it off as not useful. Some other examples include dynoing, piano matching, which if you don't know, piano matching is whenever you stack your hands next to each other and you kind of swap some fingers around to be able to make them fit. Some other examples here include different grip types. Most of us get really strong at typically 2 different grip types. Most people have one type of open hand that they like and one kind of active gripping position that they like. Really common to that might be like full crimp and front 3 drag, or maybe half crimp and 4-finger open hand. Maybe any combination between them. The thing is, our skills and our strengths are reinforcing. If you're really strong in a half crimp, you're going to use it all of the time. And the more you use it, the more you see it as this overarching utility tool of, oh, well, I can just half crimp everything. And then it goes one step further. You start to think, well, I never full crimp, so why do I even need it? Or I never front 3 drag, I just don't think it's that useful of a grip. But the thing is, you only think it's not useful because you never use it and because you're not good at using it yet. If you were to take the time and develop strength and skill with these grip positions or with those techniques I mentioned earlier, you'd realize, oh, there's a reason so many other people use these things and that they're actually very valid techniques and strengths. But if you don't ever take the time to shore up these weaknesses or these gaps, it's hard to even call them a weakness because so many people just ignore them outright. But if you take the time to shore up these gaps in your climbing, suddenly you've got a new tool to use. Like you start seeing them everywhere and you'll say, oh, I used to think I would have to bump through this sequence and, come in and do a lot of extra moves. Turns out I can just piano match on small crimps. I was just never good at it because I never practiced it. I've brought this up multiple times, but the initial learning curve for anything is enormous. If you're bad at something or if you just avoided it forever, just a little bit of practice will make you so much better at this thing. So once again, find these things that you write off, that you just think, I don't know why anyone else does it. To me, it seems silly and useless. Lean in, practice these things. See, maybe you're right. Maybe for you, this isn't that helpful. But what if you're wrong? And what if you get a new tool or a new strength because of it? Number 47, controlling your skin for damage and cuts. As you become a more advanced climber, holds get smaller and you also have to do bigger moves, maybe not in the greatest amount of control to them. So you hit smaller holds faster, which means we damage our skin a lot. There becomes this trade-off at a certain point to where you will no longer have to end sessions because of physical exhaustion, which hopefully don't go to complete physical exhaustion. Let's just get that out of there. Like, You know, you'll no longer have to end your session just because your peak power dips. On a lot of climbs, you'll actually have to switch to a different climb because your skin is so damaged. Like anytime you grab a small sharp crimp, it's going to put like, you know, a tiny little seam in your skin. There's a couple ways we can handle that. For instance, for one, you can take like a file like this. This is sold by Power Company Climbing. You can take it and just kind of file your skin down so that little seam can kind of blend in with the rest of your skin. And that's a really good way to go. That seam forms from where that hold hits you. And if you keep grabbing that same hold, it's going to keep grabbing the same spot and it's going to peel back more and more layers. And suddenly you're going to look down and realize, oh, I'm bleeding. And the thing is, when you go from good skin to thin skin to bleeding, the amount of time it takes to recover dramatically increases. Because thin skin, or even just like some like splits where you don't bleed, yeah, those kind of suck and they take a while to heal. But if you actually get through your skin and you start bleeding, man, suddenly, like we're talking about maybe 2 weeks to get to good skin again. And that's like, if you're taping your skin, you're not climbing on that same holds again. It takes a lot more work. So for you, it's very important to learn how to mitigate as much skin damage as possible. There are a couple of great ways that we can do this. Number one is just pay attention to your skin. If you're climbing on something sharp, or if you fall off and you're like, ooh, my skin's a little tender, look at it. We do this a lot. I don't have to tell you, or I'm sure you've seen a lot of people do this. You fall, you look at your hands. Ask them, why are they betraying you? And then, once we're done with that, we can kind of take time, look, and see, okay, like, where am I actually taking damage? What hold is that from? Because that's important. From there, how do we mitigate this? So step one, pay attention. Step two, keeping your skin kind of cool. When your body gets really hot, you tend to sweat out of your hands a lot. So learning how to regulate your body's temperature and specifically your skin's temperature. So keeping your skin as cool as possible without numbing out, it really helps your skin from getting wet and seepy and just getting torn up. So the cooler it is, the more tough and resilient it is. That's really important. I personally love using like a fan, or if there's a breeze, keep your hands out of your pockets pointing at the breeze. You can swing your hands around. One thing that works really well for me is I will stand barefoot on a cold rock, and that just helps drop your core temperature really well. And if your core temperature drops, your hands will cool down too. Obviously, we have to balance this out because if you get so cold that suddenly your muscles start to get cold, then you're in trouble because you're not going to perform as well. The next things you can do is, once you have sustained some skin damage, is you can file in the early stages, or you can take something like cuticle clippers or convex fingernail clippers, and you can trim back any large chunks of skin that are starting to peel away. Because main thing we want to keep from happening is, if you start to get any sort of little like flaps or chunks sticking out, we need to get rid of those as fast as possible because we don't want them to catch on rock and pull and tear. That's a really bad time, and that can lead to some real damage. Another method you can use is to start taping before the damage becomes too severe. Let's say you're trying a move, and this is also great if a hold's really sharp, but the move itself is pretty easy. Go ahead and just tape for it, because tape is a little bit slippery. It makes it harder to grab things. But if the move itself isn't that hard, and if you can get around the rest of the boulder, or even just rehearse that move in isolation with tape, and then save going without tape for your red point burns, that's a really great way to go, just so that you don't start that initial damage. Lastly, consider using alternate beta. Let's say a hold is really good in this one specific way, but there's just a razor that is cutting my pointer finger. I might sprag my fingers, I might just grab it something slightly differently. Oftentimes I'll just put my thumb on the razor, like I sacrifice my thumbs constantly. I don't know why. I am obsessive about not losing skin on any of my fingers, but thumb, they're not one of the real appendages. Like, they can take the damage. But if you can find a way how to grab a hold slightly differently, even if the hold is a little bit worse, but it doesn't do skin damage, it might be worth it. Because here's the thing. Let's say with that example where I was saying, oh, this hold's really good, but there's a razor for my pointer finger. Let's say I can only give it 6 or 7 tries before it splits my finger, or I have to use tape, which is going to make it harder, and maybe that's going to nullify the advantages of that sharpness. Maybe if I grab the hold slightly sideways, it's a little more slopey, more of a pinch instead of a crimp, and the hold's harder to use and the move's harder, but instead of 6 tries, maybe I can do as many tries as I want. I can go to muscular failure if I want. So I can get 40 tries on this hold versus 6 on this. So even though it's slightly harder, there's so much coordination and technique and understanding of movement and how to apply our strength in climbing that I will take 40 goes versus 6 goes a lot of times. Like, this would have to be dramatically easier. You know, if I'm trying to flash a boulder, yeah, we're grabbing razors, who cares? But if I'm projecting something, I will often swap to a slightly more comfortable skin-friendly grip if that allows me to get more repetitions in on hard moves. Number 48, addressing affectations in your climbing style. So it's kind of a funny phrase. An affectation is essentially a way of talking, a behavior, or a way of writing that is artificial and used to impress people. So how does that apply to climbing? And why is it a bad thing? Early on, when we get stronger in climbing, most strength just kind of goes to getting better at climbing because you're so technically bad that you're going to constantly improve. But something that I see happen with advanced climbers fairly often is they will go through this strength training phase. They then take all of this strength that they've gained and they end up applying more of it towards looking strong, like looking like a strong climber on the wall, than they do at actually performing better. Some of the ways that this can show up is starting to climb overly controlled. So maybe you are locking off moves where it's much more efficient to use a little momentum. Maybe you are just climbing more slowly than you need to. You are really exaggerating how well you have agency over this climb, where maybe being a little more loose with it and flowing through might not look as cool. You're not going to look as strong, but it's a much more efficient way to climb. Other ways this can show up is cutting feet when it's not necessary, you know, kind of jumping around to holds, even though you could keep your feet on and save more energy. A funny way that this can also show up is kind of turning into a one-armed climber. People will, when their fingers suddenly feel really strong, they'll grab holds and they'll kind of let go of a low one just before they even need to really over-exaggerate how much they can control a single hold. One of the reasons we do this is because feeling strong is fun. And like, man, we've been bad at rock climbing for so long that when you finally have some of that, some of like, oh, I can lock off this crux move on a grade level that used to be hard for me, we kind of want to do it. It feels cool, it looks cool. For once, you're not just getting your teeth kicked in by every rock climb you get on. Like, you can kind of bully them back a bit. And that's fun, that feels good. But it becomes a problem in that it wastes energy and it's bad for performance. You know, there's this common idea of, God, if my hands were only as strong as like Alex Magos's, I would climb so hard. But realistically, most of us would just fritter that strength away. We would dump it into climbing like a complete asshole. And it would be fun. It would be a great time. You would still climb harder. But whenever we get stronger, we need to take every ounce of extra strength we have and distribute it into as much efficiency and technique and skill as we can so that it can go as far as possible. You know, one of the best examples I have of this is many years ago, I was climbing in the Southeast, and the training season there, which is like a lot of the spring, all of the summer and early fall, is very long. So it's very common for people to have massive training seasons and to make pretty significant gains in, you know, those like 7 months between rock climbing. And this one summer, there were these 2 teenage guys. Both of them started the summer probably climbing like V5. Both just trained nonstop. And also they're teenage boys, like they're going to respond to training really well. They were somewhat newer to climbing, had only been climbing probably like 3 to 4 years at that point. Both trained super hard, got really strong. And watching them in the gym, it was like, man, they're both leveling up a ton. Now, the fascinating thing was when the season actually kicked off, they had incredibly different results. One of them, right out of the gate, was climbing like V8 now, very quickly. And by the end of the season, he was climbing V10. He had broken into a couple of climbs in that grade in the style that fit him. For the other guy, it was a completely different experience. Instead, he went from V5 to V6, and I think maybe like a V7 or 2, But if you watched him climbing on these V6s, you'd be like, oh, this must be like a V10 climber, because he was locking everything off, slowly grabbing every hold and over controlling everything, not holding swings if he didn't have to. He would slowly typewriter through positions and really force his way through these climbs in a way that required a ton of strength, but he was never able to really turn that into performance. Even a few years later was the last time I saw him, and he still hadn't improved that much. Like, yes, he had climbed a grade or two higher, but I mean, for the strength he had gathered, yeah, he had put it all into looking good on the wall rather than climbing well on the wall. It's for this reason that I think that sport climbing can actually be a very useful tool even for boulderers, because it's just more punishing. If you have bad, inefficient practices, man, it's going to show up in sport climbing. You're just going to get whomped if you try and lock off every move, if you try and be over-controlled. If you can't give up some of your control and become more efficient, more relaxed, and learn how to move well, and you just want to kind of flex on everything, you're going to get punished by sport climbing. I think sport climbing can be a really great tool for this, and it can filter out some of these inefficiencies that we develop over time. It's important to be ruthless when you're assessing your climbing style. Are you climbing in a way that's actually effective, or is it just something that feels cool and that's pretty? And if that's your goal, that's fine. But if your intention is to climb as well as possible with the tools you have, you need to cut away all of this artifice and all of these things that aren't helping you and only keep around what actually works. Thanks for joining along on this last episode. If there are any points in particular that you thought were interesting and you'd like to see a full video on, let me know. I've been really appreciating y'all's input and all the dialogue that we've been having in the comments section, so please keep that going. I really enjoy it, and I appreciate y'all contributing to this channel in that way. Thanks for following along, and I'll see you next time.